Jacob deceived his father into blessing him instead of blessing his elder brother Esau. His actions angered Esau so much that he had to flee. He had to run to go live with his uncle because Esau was planning on taking his brother's life. That's how angry he was. So he fled to live with his uncle Laban, and while living with his uncle, Jacob got a taste of his own medicine. Again, he had tricked his father, he had tricked his brother, and so now living with his uncle, he saw Rachel, and he fell in love with Rachel, and he agreed with his uncle that he'd work for him 7 years, and after those 7 years were over, he'd be able to marry Rachel. Well, the trickster was tricked. The supplanter was supplanted. Laban gave him his other daughter in marriage, and he ended up working an extra 7 years, an additional 7 years, to marry Rachel. And I really think it's at that point in his life, after he had been deceived and he saw how bad that was and felt how bad that was, and other things his uncle did as well, that his life started to turn around, and it was finally when he encountered God, and we'll read this in chapter 32, where he encountered God and he, in a quite literal sense, wrestled with God, when things really changed for him. And he's given a new name by God, the name Israel. So if you have your Bible, please open it with me to Genesis chapter 31. We're going to be looking at chapters 31 and 32 tonight and seeing what lessons we can learn from these Old Testament stories. And so when we begin tonight and we look at chapter 31, we see that Jacob fled from Laban. And at this point, he wanted to move away from his uncle. He wanted to be on his own and for his family to grow on their own. And in ancient times, livestock were a common form of currency. A person could, and we're talking, these stories are thousands and thousands of years old. In ancient times, people could barter and trade with sheep and cattle and so on. You could trade some, livestock for some maybe clothes that someone had made and things like that. So it was a form of currency. And as I mentioned, Jacob had been working with his uncle for 14 years. So how do you separate his currency, his livestock that he had earned working with his uncle from what belonged to his uncle? That'd be kind of a tricky thing to do after that long period of time. So the two of them came to an agreement that Jacob would take all the animals that were spotted or dark, just to summarize it, and his uncle would take the rest. And his uncle quickly agreed to that deal. All just the lighter colored sheep and lighter colored animals, solid colored animals, they'd stay with Laban. And so Jacob paid attention to his animals. He selected the strongest ones to breed, and soon his livestock outnumbered Laban's. And when we look at the beginning of chapter 31, Genesis 31, verses 1 and following, it says, "And he heard the words of Laban's son, saying, Jacob hath taken away all that was our father's, and of that which was our father's hath he gotten all this glory." And then verse 2 says, "Jacob beheld the countenance of Laban, and behold, it was not toward him as before. And the Lord said unto Jacob, Return unto the land of thy fathers, to thy kindred, and I will be with thee." So Laban's countenance was, the King James says, his countenance was no longer toward Jacob, meaning his attitude toward Jacob had changed. His uncle was no longer looking favorably on his nephew. So Jacob realized, he wanted to leave before, but now he realized real quick, it's definitely time for him to leave. And in verse 30, we see the Lord's instructions that it's now time for him to go back to Canaan, back to where his immediate family was. Go down to verse 7 with me, chapter 31, verse 7. And these are Jacob's words to his wives. Verse 7, he says, "Your father hath deceived me and changed my wages 10 times, but God suffered him not to hurt me." So again, these were his words to Rachel and Leah, his wives. And they agreed that Laban had not acted wisely. They too were ready to leave and start a new chapter in their lives. If we go down to verses 14 and following, chapter 31, verse 14, Rachel and Leah answered and said unto him, Is there yet any portion of inheritance for us in our father's house? Are we not counted of him strangers? For he hath sold us, and hath quite devoured also our money. And for all the riches which God hath taken from our father, that is ours and our children's, now then whatsoever God hath said unto thee, do. So they weren't happy with the way their father had conducted himself and the choices he made. And so they essentially say to Jacob, if God's told you to do something, now's the time to do it. Right? And again, God told him to leave. So it seems like they're all ready to leave and again be on their own as a family. So Jacob did decide to leave, and he did so without saying goodbye to Laban. He decided to leave secretly. And it's interesting, there's several times in this context where it implies Laban was going to act violently towards Jacob and perhaps even Jacob's family. So Jacob had some good reason to leave quickly and leave without notifying Laban. So let's go ahead and read verses 17 and following. Chapter 31, verses 17 and following. It says, Then Jacob rose up and set his sons and his wives upon camels, and he carried away all his cattle and all his goods which he had gotten, the cattle of his getting which he had gotten in Padan Aram, for to go to Isaac his father in the land of Canaan. And Laban went to shear his sheep, and Rachel had stolen the images that were her father's. And Jacob stole away unawares to Laban, the Syrian, and that he told him not that he fled. So he fled with all that he had, and rose up and passed over the river, and set his face toward the Mount Gilead. So again, Jacob collected his belongings, he collected all his livestock, his family members, and he left. Now, verse 19 is interesting, and this will come up later in the story. As they're leaving, Rachel decides to steal her father's, the King James says, images. Right? These were some kind of idols that he had in his house, household idols. And later in the text, when Laban himself speaks about these, Laban calls them gods. So to Laban, these were gods. So that's an interesting point I'll touch on later. Family situations can be very complicated. Jacob and Laban were relatives, but their relationship was clearly at a breaking point. And I know from personal experience how family dynamics can be stressful at times, whether it's a husband and wife, or parents, or aunts, or uncles, or cousins, and so on. Again, I understand how things can sometimes be difficult in a family. Different family members have different beliefs, make different choices, maybe choices and beliefs that you wouldn't make as a Christian, or beliefs you wouldn't have as a Christian. I understand how complicated things can be sometimes with family. And considering the complexities of family, God does give us some clear guidelines to follow as believers. And here, going all the way back to Genesis, here's God's instructions regarding, marriage and how family should start. And by the way, it's worth noting when Jesus talked about marriage, he did go back and reference Genesis. These principles are found before the law of Moses. And in my humble opinion, these are eternal principles, at least as far as people are alive in this world. These are basic principles we should follow, that God created a man and a woman. Marriage is for them. It mentions here them leaving father and mother. Adam said, This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and they shall be one flesh. Genesis 2, verses 23 and 24. Here I like that the King James rhymes. The idea here is leave and cleave. Right? When a couple gets married, ideally they should leave their parents and they should cleave, they should be joined together, and they should start their own family. They should be their own family together. Again, not that they disrespect their parents or anything, or they have to move across the world or something, but they are to be their own, independent family at that point, ideally. You look at Jacob's situation, that wasn't happening. Because again, Jacob was tricked to working for his uncle for at least 14 years, and his wife's, Laban's daughters, are still there, in a certain sense, still under the authority of their father, even though they're married now. And so Jacob wanting to leave, we can see it's God's will from the context. Because again, if we go back to chapter 31, verse 3, God's telling him to go back to Canaan, to leave. But also just generally, God's plan for a marriage is for a marriage to be its own thing, a husband and wife to be on their own and have their own family and their own time together. So Jacob was prevented from doing this, and I do believe this is was the cause of some of the difficulties he was facing at this point in his life. So he decided to leave, and again, that was a good thing for him to leave this situation. It was God's will in the context, and also just generally regarding his family. That was God's will as well. So they left, and again, interestingly, Rachel stole these images, these household idols from her father. Let's continue with verse 22, chapter 31, verse 22. And it was told Laban on the third day that Jacob was fled, and he took his brethren with him and pursued after him 7 days' journey. And they overtook him in the Mount Gilead. And God came to Laban the Syrian in a dream by night, and said unto him, Take heed that thou speakest not to Jacob either good or bad. So when Laban learned that Jacob had left, him and his family are gone, his daughters are gone, he went after Jacob and his family. And while pursuing Jacob, God appeared to him in a dream. If you look at the end of verse 24, God revealed to him saying, take heed that you do not speak to Jacob, he says, either good or bad. And from the context, we can know this is some kind of Hebrew idiom or Hebrew expression. The exact meaning is uncertain because we know, as we keep reading, Laban did literally talk to Jacob, and he did say a few maybe unfavorable or bad things maybe. So this is some kind of Hebrew expression. It likely means, do not do him harm. That you are to go and you are to be neutral, you are to be harmless. And we'll see this comes up again in a moment. So Laban caught up with Jacob and he began to question him. Basically, why did you leave without saying goodbye? If we go to verse 27, again, Laban's words to Jacob, he said, Wherefore didst thou flee away secretly and steal away from me, and didst not tell me, that I might have sent thee away with mirth, and with songs, and with tabret, and with harp, and hast not suffered me to kiss my sons and my daughters? Thou hast now done foolishly in so doing. And notice in verse 29, he says, It is in the power of my hand to do you hurt. So again, this is one of a few references here to violence. He's saying, I have this power, I have the ability to harm you. And again, he's talking about physical harm. He says, I have this power to do you hurt, but the God of your father spake unto me yesternight, saying, Take thou heed that thou speak not to Jacob either good or bad. So again, this is what leads commentators and expositors of the Bible to believe this phrase means to not do harm. Because he says, I have power to hurt you, but God said, don't talk to you good or bad. So again, that's likely what the phrase means, to be harmless, to be neutral. So Laban was angry. He says he wanted to say goodbye to his family, to his daughters, to his grandchildren. And Jacob had robbed him of that. Laban describes again how God met with him in a dream and told him not to speak to Jacob either good or bad. And then as you keep on reading, Laban wanted to know who stole his gods, right? Because he evidently looked at his house before he left and realized there were some things missing. And there's an interesting point here as you read it. Again, Laban, in the text, when Laban speaks, he calls them gods. And we're reading the book of Genesis. The Bible teaches Genesis was written by Moses. It was penned by inspiration, written by Moses. And when Moses refers to these things that were stolen, Moses never calls them gods. Depending on your translation, he calls them images or household idols, but he never calls them gods. And again, that's an interesting point, and it shows you their different point of views, their different beliefs. Again, Laban, on some level, was practicing idolatry. And Moses, again, just called them images, just images. So Rachel stole them as she left. She stole them. There's this whole story how she hid them from him and he couldn't find them even though he's looking through their camp and everything. You can go ahead and read that in your free time. I won't get in that story tonight. I think it's kind of interesting. Some commentators suggest Rachel stole these idols so her father would stop practicing idol worship. And that's one interpretation, That's kind of a funny one to me. I don't know if that's the best way to change someone's mind is to steal whatever steal your father's thing. But that's what she did. And he didn't get them back, apparently. So that's kind of a funny part of the story, if you ask me. So he's upset, but eventually he calms down, and Jacob and Laban made this covenant, and they part on peaceful terms. And again, if you like to take notes, verses 44 through 47 mentions this agreement or this covenant that they made, and then they left on good terms. So Laban went back to his home, and now Jacob and his family are headed back to Canaan, where they could be their own family. And again, that idea of leaving and cleaving could now be fulfilled in their life as a family. So as we keep reading, again, Jacob is headed back to Canaan, where he'd be reunited with his family, where he would encounter his brother again. And as he's traveling to Canaan, there's this fascinating story about how he wrestles with God, or perhaps you could call it an angel. He wrestles with an angel. So let's pick up with chapter 32. Chapter 32, verses 1 and 2. It says, Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. And when Jacob saw them, he said, "This is God's host." And he called the name of the place Mahanaim. It's interesting, several times Jacob encounters angels and or God. Previously, when he was in Bethel, and he saw the ladder or the stairway, we're told that happened in a dream. He had this kind of what we might call prophetic dream where God reveals himself to him in a dream. But here it's not a dream. It just says as he's traveling, as he's going on his way, verse 31, it says the angels of God met him. So apparently now this is taking place in his regular waking life. He encounters these angels of God. And I believe this is meant to show that God was still with him. God was blessing him on his journey back to Canaan. And so you have this short description. I believe there's 8 times where God reveals himself to Jacob. And here at the beginning of the chapters is one of them. Let's keep reading. Let's go down to verse 6. So he's traveling back to Canaan. He sent out some messengers before them. And in verse 6 it says, the messengers returned to Jacob saying, "We came to thy brother Esau. And also he cometh to meet thee, and 400 men with him." Then Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed, and he divided the people that was with him, and the flocks and herds and camels into 2 bands, and said, "If Esau come to the one company and smite it, then the other company which is left shall escape." So if you recall, again, Jacob did not leave his family on the best of terms. Years and years ago when he left, Esau was so exceedingly angry that he planned on killing his brother. And so that's why he had to flee. So Jacob's now returning home. It's been over 14 years, but he's returning home, and he learns that Esau is going to meet him. And his thought is he still has a grudge. He's going to hurt us. He's going to strike us. And it mentions there he is coming with 400 men. And I did look up that word. It is the normal word for men. It's ish, right? Back where we just read she shall be called woman because she's taken out of man. It's isha and ish, woman and man. So that word just does mean men, 400 men. But in some context, it can indicate soldiers. And you got to wonder, who are these 400 men traveling with Esau? Right? They're probably, again, warriors or soldiers. And immediately, Jacob thinks again his brother's coming to do him harm, and he breaks up his people into two camps or bands, and he says, well, if they attack one, the other one can get away. So he's making these plans to protect himself, to protect his family. He's worried about his family. So as he's mulling over these things in his mind, he starts to pray. And I think there's a good lesson for us to think about. Let's continue with verse 9. Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham, and God of my father Isaac, the Lord which said unto me, return unto thy country and to thy kindred, and I will deal well with thee. I am not worthy of the least of all thy mercies, and of all the truth which thou hast showed unto thy servant. For with my staff I passed over this Jordan, and now I am become two bands. Deliver me, I pray thee, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, lest he will come and smite me and the mother with the children. So he's worried about his family. He prays to God, asking God for protection. And again, I think there's just a general lesson here. It's always good to pray. Whether times are good or whether times are bad, we should be people of prayer. And perhaps in stressful times, we feel maybe more urgent need to pray. And again, Jacob here's stressing out. He's worried for the safety of his family, so he takes a moment to pray. Again, you see a very, I think, humble attitude here from Jacob that perhaps we haven't seen so much, again, up to this point in the story, this point in the biblical record. If you look at the end of verse 10, he mentions, when he crossed the Jordan, all he has is a staff. And now as he's coming back home, he's got two camps. He's got two bands. That's how much his family and his wealth has grown. So basically, he's saying, I started with nothing, and now I'm coming back home with just an abundance of prosperity and wealth. And he was thankful to God for, again, the ways he'd been blessed. So again, I think a really good example of prayer and a humble attitude in prayer. So he asked God for protection. So he's, again, thinking about these things. He knows Esau's making his way toward him to meet Jacob. Let's go down to verse 22. Chapter 32, verse 22. And he rose up that night and took his wives and his 2 women servants and his 11 sons and passed over the ford Jabbok. And he took them and sent them over the brook and sent over that he had. So he sends them over this brook or this stream Jabbok. So everyone's sent. There's quite a few people. They're all sent ahead of him, and he's on the other side of this brook Jabbok by himself. And as I'm not sure if he wants to pray more. The text isn't clear why he stays by himself at this moment, but he's there by himself. And a man confronts him. Let's keep reading with verse 25. Verse 24, it says, Jacob was left alone, and there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of the day. So he's there alone. Everyone's been sent ahead and they're gone. And a man appears and starts wrestling with him. Now, wrestling or grappling as a martial art is as old as humanity. Mesopotamia is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, civilizations ever. And there are ancient depictions and illustrations of people wrestling from Mesopotamia. Even today as a sport in school and Olympics, people practice freestyle or Greco-Roman wrestling. So again, it's been around forever. So here this man appears and he starts to wrestle with Jacob, and they're wrestling, I don't know what time it is, but they wrestle all the way through the night till the break of day. And, Jacob was told his brother was coming with 400 men. And perhaps this is just speculation, but maybe he thought this was one of the men of Esau, and he's now fighting him and he has to defend himself. So he starts he starts wrestling this man, and we'll see in a moment he learns this was no ordinary man. So Jacob sends his family across the river. He's alone. This man confronts him. It doesn't really say how it happened or how it started. It just says he's alone. Then all of a sudden he's wrestling this person who shows up. So verse 24 mentions the start of this. Verse 25, when he saw that he prevailed not against him, that is, this man is wrestling Jacob, the man was not prevailing or overpowering Jacob. When he saw that he prevailed not against him, he touched the hollow of his thigh. And the hollow of Jacob's thigh was out of joint as he wrestled with him. And touch is an interesting translation here. Some other translations say struck. So the wrestling, this man's not overpowering Jacob, and so at some point he touches or he strikes Jacob's hip, and his hip is dislocated. And, Jacob must have been pretty tough. Wrestling is exhausting, just doing it normally in good conditions. It's super exhausting. But he keeps wrestling with his hip dislocated. So Jacob must have been a pretty tough individual. So he keeps wrestling. Verse 26, he said, "Let me go." This is the man speaking to Jacob. The man says, "Let me go." Verse 26, "Let me go, for the day breaketh." And he said, "I will not let thee go, except thou bless me." So this man says to Jacob, "Let me go." And Jacob says, "No, you're going to bless me first." And again, he's doing this with his hip out of joint. And again, this indicates Jacob understood something was different about this person. One man's not going to seek the blessing of just some random enemy or opponent. He wants this man's blessing. And again, at this point onward, Jacob believes this is a manifestation of God, that God has confronted him and is literally wrestling with him. So he says, "No, I'm not going to let you go except you bless me." Verse 27, and he said unto him, "What is thy name?" And he said, "Jacob." And this is significant because names have meaning. Jacob means supplanter. It means, in a certain sense, like a deceiver almost. So he says, "What is your name?" He says, "Jacob." Verse 28, and he said, "Thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel. For as a prince hast thou power with God and with men, and hast prevailed." So it's interesting, the angel, this manifestation of God, he wants Jacob to say his name. Again, identifying who he's been up to this point. He's been a supplanter up to this point in his life. A man who's deceived others. And he changes his name. He changes his name to Israel. Israel means one who has power with God. And it's an interesting name. That word power, it can refer to physical power, physical exertion like wrestling, like they were doing, fighting each other. But it can also indicate power in the sense of an authority like a prince. And that is mentioned in verse 28. He says, "You have power with God." Let me back up. He says, "For as a prince hast thou power with God and with men, and you've prevailed." So he's given a better name, right? Israel, as far as what that name implies and what it means, it's a stronger name than Jacob. So the angel gives him this new name. And again, the people of Israel come from this man. So this is the name that they'll have later on. God's people, the people of Israel. Verses 29 and 30, Jacob asked him and said, "Tell me, I pray thee, thy name." And he said, "Wherefore is it that thou dost ask after my name?" And he blessed him there. And Jacob called the name of the place Peniel. "For I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved." So again, an interesting story, and there's a few others like this where someone has an encounter with God, or again, depending on how you want to look at it, a representative of God, and they ask, "What is your name?" And he refuses to answer. And that's what happens here. Jacob says, "Well, what's your name?" And he says, "Why do you ask my name?" Right? And he doesn't tell him. But Jacob believed he encountered God. He names this place, verse 30, Peniel, which means the face of God. So he believed he'd seen God and encountered God that day. Now again, the prophet Hosea, he writes about this incident in Jacob's life. And again, he's an inspired writer. Hosea is a prophet of God. And two interesting things here. Hosea references the meaning of this man's two names, Jacob's two names. Hosea 12, verses 3 and 4, it says, "He took his brother by the heel," and the womb. That's what Jacob means, heel grabber, supplanter. And it says, "By his strength he had power with God." Again, that's what Israel means. It means power with God. So he mentions both his names. Then verse 4, he says, "Yea, he had power over the angel." So Hosea calls this being that he grappled with an angel. He had power over the angel and prevailed. He wept and made supplication unto him, and he found him in Bethel, and there spake with us. So here he speaks about Jacob's continual prayer and how he made supplication to God. Now, sometimes the Bible describes a manifestation of the Lord God in the Old Testament, and as you keep reading, it says an angel or an angel of the Lord appeared to a certain person. And this would be a context like that, where Jacob believes he's encountered God. He says he's seen the face of God. But then Hosea says he saw an angel. He wrestled with the angel or had power over the angel. And this is an interesting topic and one I don't have time to go into detail on. But again, if anyone likes to take notes, you could jot down Exodus 3, verses 1 through 5, where that same thing takes place. And there's several other passages where you see that happen, where the text speaks of God, but then it speaks of the angel of the Lord, and they're used interchangeably. That happens in Exodus 3. That's the burning bush passage, where Moses sees the bush on fire, and it's burning and burning and burning, but it's not consumed. And he sees the angel of the Lord, but then God starts to talk to him. The text refers to God. So again, there's a passage where God and the angel of the Lord are used interchangeably or spoken of interchangeably. And it's a very interesting topic, and that's pretty much all I can say. And I'll end with this. Some Christians suggest that these Old Testament passages, which describe a manifestation of God, but then God's presence is made known through an angel, that these are early appearances of Jesus Christ. These are appearances of Christ before he came into the world as a flesh and blood human being. And that Christ visited men like Abraham and Jacob before he was manifested in the flesh. And I do tend to agree with that point of view. I'm not super strong on it, and I'm not dogmatic about it. But I do believe there is validity to that idea, especially when we read about the angel of the Lord or the angel of Jehovah. That is likely Christ, part of the Godhead, appearing to men in the Old Testament. Consider Jesus' own words in John 8, verses 56 and following. Here he's speaking to Jews, and he says, your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and saw it, and was glad. Now that statement alone is quite intriguing. How did Abraham see the day of Christ? And some people say, well, he saw it through faith, and again, that's one way of looking at it. But it goes on and says, the Jews said to him, you're not yet 50 years old. You've seen Abraham? And Jesus replies to that, verse 58, verily, verily, I say unto you, before Abraham was, I am. And that's a clear reference back to Exodus 3 in the burning bush. And when Moses asked God, who are you? And he says, I am that I am. Tell the people of Israel, I am sent you. Right? So Jesus is saying, before Abraham existed, I am. Jesus is eternal. Jesus is part of the Godhead. He doesn't have a beginning. He has a beginning as a human being, but, He existed before the virgin birth. Again, I'm not super strong on or dogmatic about this idea, but I do believe there's reasons why Christians have come to that conclusion. I think good reasons. And again, in the Bible, a person's name has spiritual importance. And when you continue reading the text, after his name is changed to Israel, and occasionally he still is called Jacob, but he's also called Israel. But when God gives him this new name, I really do think as you keep reading the text, you see a change in his character. He becomes more humble. He acts differently from this point onward. And just very quickly, in chapter 33, when he does encounter Esau, again, Esau meant him no harm. Esau had gotten over his issues with Jacob, and he was ecstatic to see his brother. Chapter 33, verses 4 and 5, it says, Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. And he lifted up his eyes and saw the women and the children and said, who are these with thee? And he said, the children which God hath graciously given to thy servant. I mean, what a beautiful story that is about two brothers being reunited. Tonight, let's finish with Romans. I know I've gone a little bit longer tonight, but let's go to Romans chapter 12, and we'll finish with this tonight. Romans chapter 12. Again, Jacob's story, there's many lessons that we can learn from it. Things about family, things about lessons about prayer and faith in God. But again, we do see, I think, the topic of transformation in his life, that he made some positive changes. And I think he had to learn some lessons the hard way. I've faced some hard lessons in my life. I don't know about you. Sometimes we have to learn those hard lessons. He was deceived and he was tricked. And from this point onward, he didn't seem to do that kind of thing anymore. So he grew as a person. He became more considerate. He changed for the better. And, we do not literally wrestle with God or an angel like Jacob did, but we do metaphorically. We do spiritually. To walk the path of faith isn't always easy. Sometimes we have to wrestle with the things God presents with us and the information that He's given us in His inspired Word. But that is what God asks of us, to consider what He offers and to wrestle with it. And in the end, through submitting to Him, prevail and have power with God. He asks us to accept His will and change for the better. And again, if we go to Romans real quick, we'll finish with this tonight. Romans chapter 12. Again, the Scriptures urge us to transform and transform for the better through a knowledge of God's will. Romans chapter 12, verse 1. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service, and be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that ye may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Again, the Bible asks us to choose a path, either conform to the world or be transformed through the will of God. And may we all transform like Jacob did in striving to live holy lives. If there's anyone here tonight who's not yet a child of God, the invitation is extended that you can put Christ on in baptism tonight and begin your journey as a Christian. If we can aid you in doing that, now's a good time for that. If we can offer prayers or encouragement, please let us know by coming forward as we stand and as we sing.